Welcome everyone to this second workshop run by Dying with Dignity WA. My name's Steve Walker, I'm the President of Dying with Dignity WA. Just to come to Dr. Towler, I think I can be fairly brief because even though his resume is fairly long and certainly impressive, I know enough about Dr. Towler, having seen him before and met him before, to say that first of all, and very importantly, he's an engaging speaker. He'll entertain as well as inform, and you won't be bored. Looking for his resume still, but I know that Dr. Towler is currently the clinical lead on matters to do with end-of-life issues, particularly through the Cancer and Palliative Care Network in the Health Department. He's also a senior physician, I think, in intensive care or emergency intensive care. Thanks, at Fiona Stanley Hospital. He is someone who is a former, here it is, he's a former president, state president of the AMA.
Hold that against me.
He was a member of the ministerial expert panel that convened last year, chaired by Malcolm McCusker, which grappled with some of the detail, a lot of the detail of how the Voluntary Assisted Dying Act should be rolled out and indeed what the legislation should consist of. He's a fellow of a number of places: College of Intensive Care Medicine, the College of Anaesthetists, the College of Health Service Managers, and the AMA, and is previously as well a Chief Medical Officer of WA, if I didn't mention that. In his current role as end-of-life clinical care lead, he's extensively involved in the implementation of key commitments coming out of the seminal report by a Joint Select Committee of the Parliament, the My Life, My Choice report. So he's dealing there with VAD implementation, which we are heavily interested in and consider to be crucial. And he's also dealing, however, with the recommendations arising from another report, that's the Millman Committee dealing with advanced health directives that we're talking about today and advanced care plans. He's also, finally, I would say, involved with promoting the use of the My Health record to store and make accessible advanced care planning information, including advanced care directives or advanced health directives. Now, that's right on topic for us today as well. He's involved indeed in a national scheme regarding that sort of activity. So again, we're most grateful. I would now ask you to acknowledge Dr. Towler, and I'll call on him to speak to us. Thanks very much.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Thank you very much for the warm welcome from Dying with Dignity WA this morning. So just to give me a sense of who I'm talking to, who thinks they know what an advanced health directive is? Good. Is there anybody who knows nothing about it? Cool. So that will make it a little easier to get going. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional landowners on the land on which we meet today, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. It's a privilege to be living in Noongar country and sharing our culture with them. And this subject is particularly relevant in my role as an intensive care doctor. The tragedy of the fact that Aboriginal people die between 10 and 15 years earlier than the rest of us remains a sort of great sadness of the health system in which I work. And we would hope to see that things would improve for them. Is there anybody in the room who thinks they're immortal, by the way? So Peter Saul, an intensive care colleague of mine from Newcastle, did an outstanding TED talk. And if you've never seen it, I encourage you to have a look at it. It was talking about the whole issue of the approach to healthcare management of people who are approaching the end of their life, and a conversation which is really interesting. And he starts off with the conversation that he thinks that 8% of the people in the room still think they're immortal. I haven't met any of them yet where they've been able to demonstrate it, so we won't. But it does mean that in the context of what we're talking about today, this is a subject of relevance, at least at one point in your life, to everybody who's here. An advanced health directive is a statement that you make. It's a statement of your wishes. I want to give you a little bit of an outline of the extraordinary difference across Australia around this particular body of legislation and the legal principle. Does anybody able to tell me in which parliamentary act the Advanced Health Directive can be found in Western Australia? Yeah. I thought you might know. So it comes under a thing called the Guardianship and Administration Act. And that clearly has issues well beyond the delivery of health services or health treatments. But in Victoria, the most recent legislation instrument addressing this is in fact specific around medical treatment. It's a 2016 medical treatment decision and personal position paper. So one of the first and most confusing issues is even at the legislative level, there are significant differences between states in where it sits. So as a clinician, I would tend to focus on decision-making around healthcare. But in fact, because the Advanced Health Directive sits within the Guardianship Act in Western Australia, it's also relevant around life care decisions, where you might want to be treated or where you might want to live, who might look after you. And probably we won't talk much about that element of Advanced Health Directives today. Can anybody tell me the difference between an Advanced Care Directive and an Advanced Health Directive? They're all legal in different ways, and that's the really important part of this. At the national level, a committee has just completed a body of work supported by the Commonwealth Department of Health. They have rewritten a document which I was the chair of in 2011, which was an Advanced Care Directive framework for Australia, and that's now been substantially updated. That document will become visible, we think, before Christmas after going through the final endorsements. But the fundamental position here is that in that document, what has been recognised is that the broad term Advanced Care Directives will now include all documents and statements of wishes made by a competent person about their subsequent treatment choices. Let's go over that again. If you're a competent person, you provide some form of advanced indication of what you wish, that will be considered an Advanced Care Directive. In other words, it's under common law that will guide treatment. But in fact, it works a little bit differently, and I'm going to come back to that as being different from what is called a statutory Advanced Health Directive. You think there are any states in Australia without a statutory document? And what does statutory mean? There are 2 states in Australia that do not have a statutory Advanced Health Directive defined in the law, in other words, in a statute, and they are New South Wales and Tasmania. So in those 2 states, it isn't as though your wishes aren't acknowledged. It is just in Tasmania and New South Wales, they believe that the common law interpretation that your wishes properly stated in advance should be followed in delivering your care. There is one real advantage, though, of having a statutory form where the statute or the act gives specific strength to that document. Does anybody know what that issue is? What's different? Yeah.
Whether you're conscious or unconscious?
No, it's got nothing to do with that. Any of these documents relate to only people who are able to give a preemptive decision. If you write an Advanced Care Directive, then the clinician is required to take it into account. I'm going to come back to this discussion in a minute because I really want to focus on what is the pointy end of this process and when does it go wrong or go right. But in fact, the statutory document, and in Western Australia this is particularly the case, that a statutory Advanced Health Directive properly completed in line with the regulations is required to be followed and is the first position. In other words, the issues in that document must be followed. We'll come to the challenging issue of what you write in the document in a minute. But in any other context, and this is why I'm going to talk quite extensively about the idea of treatment consent, in the other situation, the information must be taken into account, but it is within a normal consent process. And I'm going to go over that in some detail in just a minute. So if you have a statutory document, the statute, that is the law, gives primacy and preeminence to what's written in that document above all other considerations. There is not a secondary process. So that the issues to be decided around the comments you made in your Advanced Health Directive come down more to whether what's written in the document it relates to the clinical situation in which we now find the patient when they're not able to make their own decision. And I would remind you that in all cases, unlike the power of attorney, which has influence even if the person has capacity, an Advanced Health Directive or Advanced Care Plan, although it may inform a treatment decision or a decision not to treat, is in fact not enforceable if the person in front of you has the capacity to make their own decision. So I've got in front of me here the operational directive from the WA Department on Health on the issues of managing consent. In other words, what are clinicians and the organisation required to do? And as you can see, it is an extremely extensive document. And in fact, it very appropriately details and outlines the consent process that is required to be followed by clinicians in the health system. It doesn't have direct enforcement in a private hospital setting, but this really defines the standard of practice. So let's just visit that for a minute. When does all this come to effect? There's a couple of things. Advanced care planning is the process we encourage all people, particularly as they develop an illness or a disease, to think about what their wishes would be, how they might want to be cared for, where they might want to be cared for, to document your beliefs, preferences and values in a way that would help us to make decisions if you can't, and really to begin to outline what approaches we might take if you find yourself in a clinical situation where you can't make your own decision. That process should predate preparing any form of advanced corrective or advanced health directive. In other words, you need to do some work to think about what matters to you and define what it is you would wish. If you then go from that, you can prepare something like a value statement that you document. And I do promote people to look at a website called the My Values website, which was developed by a colleague of mine in Victoria, Dr. Charlie Cook, who's also an intensive care doctor and currently is on the VAD board in Victoria, just out of interest. And Charlie has developed this online website which leads you through how you might write down and document the things that are important to you in thinking about treatment approaches and your care as you approach end of life. The document is converted to a PDF document. It can be sent to a link can be sent to your GP so they can open the document and read it, and then you can have a conversation with them about values, beliefs, and preferences. If you come back to the idea of consent, and I'm going to dwell on this quite a bit, if I'm having a conversation with you about having a major upcoming procedure in a hospital, then we really need to be talking about what's involved in that, what the risks are, and how you would respond if you were one of the unfortunate people who didn't have a good outcome. Clearly, the focus is always on a good outcome. If I'm talking to you personally, then I would be asking you to reflect on what's important to you. Because at law in Australia now, clinicians are required in obtaining consent for any intervention or procedure to have understood the materiality or the things that are important to the individual around the consent that they're about to sign. A very famous case called Rogers and Whitaker. Mrs. Whitaker was a lady who had an eye disease. She had one eye that she thought she would have. Mr. Rogers, who was the ophthalmologist, operate on the eye. And the comment she made to him was, "Doctor, is there any risk to my good eye on the other side?" Mr. Rogers, being very paternalistic, reassured her that there was very little risk that as a consequence of the operation on the eye, which isn't working very well, that anything could happen to the good eye. Well, there's a very unpleasant condition called sympathetic ophthalmoplegia, where when you operate on an eye, the other eye becomes affected. The incidence of that is 1 in 11,000. You would have thought Mr. Rogers was betting pretty safely. Mrs. Whitaker unfortunately developed sympathetic ophthalmoplegia and became blind. On the back of that case, law in Australia says the clinician has to make every effort to understand whether the potential complications or events that might occur with an intervention would be of significance to that individual. And if you fail to do that, that is now a law, something under the kind of negligence principles. So we know that you have to get consent. We know you now have to understand what matters to the individual. So what matters to an individual is about what's important to you, what your beliefs and values are, and what you would want to see as an outcome of the procedure. So this principle now underpins the whole process. So let's come to this issue of the point of consent, because in the end, in relation to your advanced decision about healthcare, it's only going to matter in that case situation where you're in hospital or being treated, or there's a decision to take you to hospital where you can't make your own decision. So what happens then is there's a general view that clinicians are somewhat dismissive of preemptive decisions or directions that you've given. Well, that's because prior to 2008, we mentioned that the laws changed in Western Australia about 10 years ago. But the most important part of the changes to the law in 2008 was a modification of the criminal code. Because prior to 2008, there was an absolute responsibility for a healthcare provider who was responsible for an individual to provide for all the necessities of life. And if you did not do that, you were criminally responsible. So until 2008 and the passing of the Act, doctors defaulted to the criminal code provisions and said, I really don't care what you said before, because your wishes are being gazumped by a very substantial piece of legislation that says that you would be criminally responsible for not providing treatment. The new world in which we're in now, where we are improving our understanding and now able to address people's concerns and their wishes, came out of that amendment in 2008, which coincided with the introduction of the Advanced Health Directive. Those two things were absolutely critical. So the approach to care now, what's going on in Western Australia in 2020, really only has a 12-year history. If you haven't worked it out, we graduate about 300 new doctors a year in Western Australia. And in that very important report that was mentioned, this one, light reading, 608 pages, the point was made that many doctors don't understand the law very well. And so the tendency is to default to doing what I think is best for you when you're not able to tell me what you want. So what happens in that consent situation? Who can describe, has anybody been in the position of having to be the substitute decision maker for somebody else? You don't have to tell me if you don't want to.
I wasn't asked.
Pardon?
I wasn't asked.
You weren't asked. Well, that's pretty grim. The consent process is, if I find in front of me a person who is unable to give consent for whatever reason, in other words, doesn't have the capacity, then there is somebody else who is at law now because of the changes in the Act in 2008, which now are in the Guardianship Act. There is a person who I should attempt to find who is the person of authority. That person becomes you in the decision making. Now, there is an instrument in the Guardianship Act where you can formally appoint somebody to that role. Do you know what that's called? Yeah, an enduring power of guardianship. Enduring meaning long term, and power of guardianship as different to a power of attorney. If you appoint an enduring guardian, that person can be anybody you choose. It could be your doctor if they were willing to do it. Often is a family member. But the importance of it is that under the Act, that person becomes you in the decision process. They are required to be given information. They are required to make an assessment. They have to have capacity themselves to weigh up the risks and benefits and make choices and then come to a consent decision. So they are as if they were you. Interestingly, if you have an Advanced Health Directive, they are required to honour and follow the Advanced Health Directive if the instruction aligns with, I'll come to you in a second, aligns with the clinical circumstances. So to restate the question, you've asked about the fact that the current form only has 3 boxes. It isn't actually constrained technically to 3 boxes. You can write 17 forms if you like. When they introduced the form, and this is one of the interesting issues in terms of what's happening currently with the revision to the Act, is we will not be constraining the number of options. So, but if it is in the Advanced Health Directive, then the enduring guardian is required to make an assessment of whether what you described is in fact related to the situation in which we're now facing, and if so, then they're required to follow it and support it. And so the AHD is still the most important document. The challenge here, and Dini's going to talk about it, is writing something in that form that makes sense when you're trying to align it with the clinical situation. In the Guardianship and Administration Act, there's a section which people rarely look at, which I particularly wanted to focus on a little bit today because I don't have much time, but it's in how everything operates generally. That section, which is 110S, it says the following. I'm going to read some of these sections because they're important. A treatment decision in an Advanced Health Directive operates in respect of treatment to which it applies. In other words, if the instruction relates to the clinical situation, it applies. At any time, the maker of the directive is unable to make reasonable judgments, and as we said before, it only applies if you can't manage the consent process yourself, as if the treatment decision had been made by the maker at that time. So the Advanced Health Directive speaks for you at the moment where the clinical decision to treat or not treat is being made, and as if the maker were of full legal capacity. So it is you projected into a clinical situation. Subject to subsection 3, which doesn't matter, a treatment decision in an Advanced Health Directive operates only in the circumstances specified in the directive. And this is where most of it gets into trouble. And the clinician is able to make an assessment of whether they believe that the circumstances described align with what's clinically happening. Now, if this was a normal consent situation, I would be having an exchange with you to say, well, you wrote these words, but did you really mean that also includes this particular situation or scenario? So the person who is your substitute decision maker should become available to lead that conversation. Also, it goes on to say, a treatment decision in an Advanced Health Directive does not operate if circumstances exist or have arisen that, 1, the maker of that directive would not have reasonably anticipated the time of making the directive. So the circumstances have changed. Somebody holds what is called a reasonable belief or anticipation that they think the person might have changed their mind. It goes on to say, also, would it have caused a reasonable person in the maker's position to have changed his or her mind about the treatment decision? Now, the challenge is there is no guidance as to what constitutes the idea of reasonably anticipated or a reasonable person making a different decision. So how then might we give strength to your preemptive decision so that at that point where you're in a position where a clinician is making a decision, that you would therefore be able to really mitigate these concepts of, oh no, this was written 10 years ago and they didn't know anything about this new technology. We're fantastic. We can fix anything. Please let us go ahead. And in that situation, you might say, well, reasonably, the person may not have understood that the treatment being offered is less invasive or less painful, higher probability of success, and will give reasonable quality of life. And clearly, caregivers tend to default to the position of supporting a treatment intervention. So how would you think we might address the question of reasonable anticipation at the time of making the directive? Yeah, so we've had a lovely comment here that an important approach to dealing with this particular aspect of the clinician being able to essentially dismiss what appears to be the instruction is to ensure that you update the Advanced Health Directive on a regular basis. I think doing it regularly is a good idea. If you're well, it's worth redoing it about every 2 years. But if there's a change in your circumstances, then it's important to redo it, because otherwise the clinician will say, well, this was written back when something else wasn't going on and now something is going on. And if I was in a normal consent position, this would definitely be taken into account. So if you, those of you who've got wills will know if you divorce or remarry or something else changes, your will becomes ineffective or ineligible, then you have to redo it. Although there's no instruction in the legislation, we would absolutely encourage you to refresh or renew your advance help directive. Part of the challenge there is the form's been a little difficult to work with. The work we're doing at the moment will result in the form being much more accessible, and we hope we'll be able to be in a format where you can bring the information from last time forward and refresh the form in a much more straightforward way. So really good comments. So if I were the clinician and I know that the form was done recently, it was after the diagnosis of the condition for which we're now caring for, it would be pretty unreasonable to take the view that the person might have thought differently. This reasonable thing is a challenge.
Can I ask a question, Simon? Do you think that a provision that you put into your AHD to say, notwithstanding any advances in medical treatment, I don't want any such thing to affect the instructions that I've given in my AHD?
Absolutely.
Yep.
It's going to come to other options for controlling the decision. So the first one is obviously to keep it contemporary. Now we know at law, because we all have the right to make our own decisions, if you decide not to have a treatment, whether I think you're crazy for making that decision or not, is not relevant. Every person has a right to refuse treatment. You don't always have a right to have treatment, because the clinician may feel the treatment's not likely to be effective or valuable. But everybody can refuse treatment. Question? Issues around why the reasonable person might have changed their mind about it is also based on whether they've been given proper information. And going back to that idea of Mrs. Whitaker and Dr. Rogers, there is a burden here now to ensure that people have been given information. And this is one of the challenging issues. The Advanced Health Directive in Western Australia does not require you to actually have a doctor involved in writing the document up. From my personal point of view, that is one of the reasons why the document becomes less reliable. In Victoria, the Advanced Health Directive instrument is signed by the doctor as one of the two witnesses. And this is one of the other issues. The witnessing provisions across the country are all variable, and I went through all of them the other day looking, thought, could I actually tell all these good people, if you go to this fantastic new document in Victoria, you can use it as a facsimile for the West Australian document, in other words, it would stand up. Bugger me, the witnessing provisions are different. So I can't tell you to go and do the Victorian document, which is much better than the one we've got at the moment, because the witnessing provisions are slightly different. So this issue is relevant. You may choose not to go to a doctor, and a comment like the one we've just had about I don't want to be treated if certain things happen, you're quite entitled to make on your own. But if you're making other treatment decisions, if it's not informed by the medical information behind it, then think about Mrs. Whitaker. It would be important. The clinician's usual view is my responsibility is to give you the appropriate information, and then you make a decision. Just moving quickly then through this operations of the Act. In determining whether or not subsection 3, which is the one we just talked about, would apply, this is the information that directs the doctor's decision. The matters that must be taken into account include the following. The maker's age at the time of the directive was made and the time the treatment decision would otherwise operate. In other words, somebody in putting the legislation together thinking about how you might have thought about the situation when you were younger, or maybe preempting a little bit somebody who's not a minor, but in that age between 16 and 18 who makes a decision. But the idea behind this is if you made it quite some time ago from an age point of view, you may have changed your position. And about the point of renewing the form, take into account the period that has elapsed between those times. But no specific information is given about what might be considered to be too long. And finally, whether the maker reviewed the treatment decision at any time during that period. So if you've got an advanced health directive and you've been under care by somebody and you've had a number of discussions which are well understood and documented where you've thought about the treatment that might have begun to suggest something different, then the clinician is entitled to take into account what they know of the information provided by another health professional about what you might have thought in the intervening period. So you see, the clinician is burdened with these ideas. And quite honestly, although I have a huge amount of respect for my colleagues, I don't believe that we do consent processes as well as we should do. And that for people not taking the position of the patient and taking these issues into account is actually quite a challenging exercise. So the more clear your position is, the more you have updated your form, the more you take advantage of appointing an enduring guardian who is well aware of what your current wishes are and substitutes for you, the more reliable this process will be, which is what I constantly get asked about. And the problem I have is the concerns about the clinician won't do what I wanted when they come to treatment undermines the trust relationship, which still has to sit at the middle of the consent process. So in this consent process, there are three individuals: the clinician, the patient who's not able to contribute at the moment, and the substitute decision maker. And that threesome forms the core of the process which we're trying to influence. The thing goes on to talk about if there's an enduring guardian, then use them, which makes absolute sense. If there is a guardian appointed by the public advocate, which is another important guardianship provision, that needs to be taken into account. And then under the Act, there's what's called a hierarchy of who's the next decision maker. And one of the other things about the clinical position and emergency treatment is a bit more difficult. If you're presented in the emergency department with somebody's had a cardiac arrest, the ambulance has been doing a good job and got the heart restarted after 10 minutes. The patient can't contribute to the decision making. The person may have previously written an advanced health directive, but the doctor doesn't know about it. Can't find it. Doesn't know whether what's in it relates to the current clinical circumstances or not. The Act protects the doctor from acting in what is considered to be patient best interest in an emergency situation. Even beyond that, the requirements are to try and find the substitute decision maker, person to make the decision. If you can't find them in a reasonable period of time, the doctor is entitled to take action. So there's a spectrum here. Am I dealing with an emergency situation, or is this a little less emergent? So the more these things are in place, this is why I've been so involved in this national project, to try and get people to put their advanced health directives into the My Health Record. Now, you may not be a My Health Record believer, but there is no other location currently in Australia which any registered health professional could reasonably access to check whether you have one of these if you come into hospital at 2 o'clock in the morning. If it's your hospital and you've gone to the trouble of putting your advanced health directive to the hospital, they will have it because that's now a requirement under the national standards. If I'm visiting from another state or I'm in a different part of the state, if I don't go to my usual hospital, there is nowhere at the moment where you can go to find out whether the person has a current advanced health directive. The My Health Record is the only option. So I do encourage people to consider it. Yes, I know the MyGov website's a bit clunky and getting to your My Health Record can be a bit tedious. If you have the document in a PDF form, you can actually upload it very easily if you know how to access the My Health Record. And the great thing about it is you control it. You can take it out again. Whereas the My Health Record, the advanced health directive the hospital puts in its medical record system, you would have to go and tell them to take it out. Whereas you can control it in the My Health Record, so you have much more control. And in the My Health Record, you can also include a value statement. You can include your advanced care plan. You can include a copy of your enduring guardianship. And the final piece of what's going on at the moment is you go to hospital and we do a medical goals of care conversation. We're now beginning to put that up in the My Health Record if the patient requests. So Western Australia is actually doing some leading work in this space. So to try and summarise, because I've had half an hour, probably a bit more.
Simon, I think you also mentioned that if you lodge a second AHD,
Yep.
it will automatically.
Yeah.
Yes.
So in a legal sense, an AHD, the previous one is void at the moment you sign a new one. All right, it's the challenge then is that the old one may still be floating around somewhere. And this is the other thing you can do to address these issues for the clinician. If you do choose to use the My Health Record or any other repository, and we are actually looking at the moment at developing a West Australian registry, but the Act doesn't require you to register, which I find interesting. If you write a new document, please try and ensure that it's visible, because otherwise the doctor is allowed to act on what they know is the best available information, which is whatever advanced health directive they can find that's currently in practice. So this is one of the tricky bits. And everybody asked me, well, doesn't that mean this whole idea is crazy? I said, well, yes, it is, but we can't make this perfect unless you start putting restrictions on people. If the Act said your advanced health directive does not work unless it's registered, then there would be a control over it. But that would be unduly restrictive, and everybody has rejected that. The community conversation has repeatedly suggested making it compulsory to register it would be unreasonable. So that is the position. That's the great thing about law. When the law is written, the law is the law. So, to summarise, an advanced care directive is a broad description of a document or recording or anything you can actually record it on a video, anything you like, where a person with capacity over the age of 18 describes their future wishes and can be specific around treatment decisions and treatment refusal. Does everybody kind of understand that? The Advanced Health Directive is the term now largely reserved to describe advanced care directive documents prepared in line with a statute, in other words, specific law. So it's a subset, it's a smaller group. The Advanced Health Directive in Western Australia has preeminence and primacy in decision making at law, gazumped everything. If you prepare one and the clinical situations described in the document are what applies in front of the clinician, they are required to follow it, and it is professional malpractice not to do so. But as we've described at some length, and the reason I particularly want to go through this discussion today is the clinician's decision framework is influenced by these issues, which the clinician is allowed to take into account. You give value to and you give greater strength to your Advanced Health Directive if you review it, you renew it, and you put it in a place where it can be discovered. And the new national framework for advanced care directives emphasises 3 phases: having the conversation, preparing the document, and then putting it in places where it can be found and retrieved. And that's going to drive important policy. The differences across Australia mean that unless you're in your own jurisdiction, the statutory document doesn't directly apply, but it constitutes being an advanced care directive of a non-statutory type. The easiest thing is often to go and write a new one if you've got capacity, but if you happen to be in the unusual situation where the person has lost capacity for a form written in Victoria, you can take it to the State Administrative Tribunal and have it endorsed as a legitimate document. But it's much easier to do another one if you've got capacity. Going to the tribunal is a bit of a nuisance. But you can have a document from another state made legally equivalent or made a legal advanced health directive by going to the State Administrative Tribunal. I'm going to stop there because that's a lot of information. I wanted to just this morning try and emphasise that the pointy end of this process is when the patient is under care and decisions are being made. And you can do things to improve how that process remains trusted and influenced by the decisions you make ahead of time. It does put some additional burden on you as an individual. Then I think we can be much more confident the treatment you get will be the treatment you want, or the treatment you don't get is the treatment you don't want. I'm going to stop there.
This is headed My Experience with an AHD and Beverage diagnosed in February 2020 with T4 esophageal cancer. In early April 2020, I downloaded the online AHD form. It was extremely difficult to use or to get guidance to use. It has a strange structure for accepting some things and denying others, using a form of double negative that could lead non-English speaking users astray, and gives little clue of the content one can include or the tone and style that might be appropriate. As I filled it out on the computer, my text was sometimes cut through by the computer-drawn lines, and this was impossible to adjust. A week later, I was lucky enough to receive, through a Cancer Council social worker, help from Dr. X, Director of Palliative Care in my region, to sit on my veranda, work through what I had written, and have her witness my signature on my AHD form. Dr. X had useful suggestions about the wording of the document and making the content what I required. So far, so good. However, 2, refusal to accept my AHD. Unfortunately, the first time I registered my AHD, later in April, on the second day of my treatment at Genesis Care Fiona Stanley Hospital, it was rejected out of hand. The only reason I found this out was that I had, on the advice of a friend who had found using the AHD difficult, written on my body, "Do not resuscitate, AHD in place." One of the 2 radiologists went to find my AHD so he could view it before treatment, and came back to say that it had been rejected. I was very upset, but went through with the treatment as I was already on the machine. I spoke to the receptionist, who said my AHD had been rejected by their lawyer as it had lines through some parts. I could accept that the form did have some lines through it because the type on the form provided there was no way these lines could be avoided. She also said the form was not acceptable as it was not signed by Genesis doctors. It was also compulsory that I have their form filled out. I pointed out that these were not legal requirements, but the receptionist said it was considered a requirement for them. I said I would print an empty AHD form and fill it in by hand to avoid the problems of the lines and bring it back the next day and have it signed by Genesis doctors, and in return I would sign their form even though I did not consider it a legal document. The next day I went into Genesis as the Cancer Council social worker assured me she had an agreement from Genesis to sign the forms before my treatment. However, when I arrived, it was again suggested that I have my treatment first. I refused, but also refused to leave. I let the nurses know I would miss my treatment time while I sat waiting for the doctors to sign my forms and give me theirs. Finally, after at least 2 hours, the registrar I was awaiting, and who had been sitting in his office for some time, as I pointed out to the nurses, came to get me. He talked to me for at least 45 minutes and seemed to be evaluating my mental state by the questions he asked. Eventually, he found another doctor and they pulled out their form and signed it. When I asked where I should sign, I was told there was no need. In fact, there was not a place on the form for the patient to sign. I then insisted that they both witness me signing my new AHD, which they did, but this whole process left me deeply anxious that my wishes will not be followed by institutions. So that is what happened to Anne Beveridge, and she in fact was here at last month's workshop.
If you present the hospital with an advanced health directive, they are required to store it and make it available. If you're required, and you won't pass accreditation unless you have a process in place for care planning around end-of-life care. I actually do some pre-accreditation surveys with a colleague. Let me assure you, there's a lot of work to do. Unless you make the issues clear and you set the standards, then you can't influence practice. There is no question we are not meeting the practice standards which that document aspires to. What I would say, though, is a lot of things have got better. I'll do a little bit of hospital protection here. Genesis Healthcare is our radiotherapy provider, if you understand, but they're actually an independent agency. They are independently assessed under the national standards. The problem is that when you go to the hospital, you would have no idea they're different to the rest of the hospital, but they are. The hospital is required to meet these standards. I can't tell Genesis how to do their work. If I was asked on my opinion on some of the comments made, I am disappointed that they took a legal approach. I can absolutely understand that a damn lawyer would say that a form where the line goes through the text is difficult to interpret because it looks like a strikeout. But that's the patient in this case was in front of you with capacity. You could have countersigned it or done anything. And I absolutely concur with you that the story points to problems at the behaviour level. But that goes back to what the Joint Select Committee report said about clinicians are not sufficiently aware of the law and their responsibilities and accountabilities under it. There is absolutely no basis for saying you must sign a Genesis form. And essentially what you're saying there is what we call a goals of care form, because it's not a form developed by you and signed by you. In the absence of a signature, it doesn't even constitute an advance health directive. Isn't even in the same ballpark. So your question, that is the question that needs to be put to the hospitals and the providers when we begin to see more and more of this in play.
Sincerity, that is one of the most informative, practical, constructive, useful sessions that I've ever, on any topic that I've ever participated in. Both his presentation and his answers to the questions. The dialogues were wonderful, and I think we've been extremely lucky to have Dr. Towler. Let's give him a round of applause.
Just a disclaimer, it's pretty obvious. We're not trying to prescribe what you should put in your AHD. This is just intended to provide you with a couple of examples about what you might do in relation to describing the circumstances and the treatment decisions that need to be made. Now, what I'm excited about is that this fictional person, Jane Smith, is actually me. And so this is my advanced health directive, and I am going right to the top to get a critique on whether or not it's going to work. And so this is going to be a very interesting little workshop on whether or not my AHD is going to be effective.
What about your
Yeah, that's a little bit generous, I think, but never mind. We have gone through in some detail what its defects are. And I don't think that I need to go through that again. The lines through the text, sometimes there's ambiguity, only 3 treatment and decision options. When you have to initial, what does tick or cross mean? I think that comes up in relation to the EPG. It says place either a tick or a cross in the box, and you don't know whether a tick means yes or a cross means no, or whether either the tick or the cross will do. Thanks. So when those of you who came to the Voluntary Assisted Dying Eligibility and Process Requirements Workshop last time, I should catch up with all this. It's not working. Never mind. Sorry, I'll just have to turn away and talk to the screen. So there are certain requirements before you can make an AHD. You have to be an adult and you must have full legal capacity. A lot of this stuff is a repeat of what Simon said, but because it is lengthy and complicated, I thought it wouldn't do any harm just to run through it quickly again. What full capacity means, nobody really knows. Does it mean that just because I go from the living room to the kitchen and forgotten why I'm there, that I don't have capacity? But luckily there is a section in the GAR Act, as I will call it, section 110R2, which describes what capacity means. And you will remember that in the Voluntary Assisted Dying Act, the same applied. It was specific to the decision that you're actually going to make. And so what the Act actually says is a treatment decision in an advanced health directive is invalid if at the time the directive is made, its maker does not understand the nature of the treatment decision and the consequences of making that decision. And there is a presumption that you have capacity unless there's evidence to the contrary. So signing and witnessing, I think that we covered this in the last session, but if you are not able to physically sign the form, but you still have capacity, you can direct somebody else to sign it for you, and it must be signed in the presence of 2 witnesses, one of whom just needs to be an adult and the other one who must be authorised under the Oaths, Affidavits and Statutory Declarations Act. It would seem to me to make a lot of sense that that should be your doctor and that you should have discussed your decisions with your doctor prior to that. And incidentally, just as an aside, this has nothing to do with this presentation, but if you have not already approached your own doctor to ascertain whether they are willing to participate in the voluntary assisted dying process, we do have those letters, one from Fiona Stanley urging people to participate, and the other one from Dying with Dignity, which is just an introductory letter.
So you mean the professor, not the hospital?
I mean the professor, not the hospital. Thank you very much for that clarification, Simon. But Gay and Gaylor got them at the registration table at the back. Yes.
One quick point, I don't know whether you're going to cover it, but if you do have somebody as the alternate person signing, you can't also be a witness. You're excluded.
Well, I was going to mention that, but that seems to be so self-evident that it's like saying you can't witness your own signature.
Yeah.
You cannot witness your own signature, and nor can the person who signed on your behalf be a witness of his or her own signature.
In Queensland, there's a little unit called the Advanced Care Planning Unit who look at the documents in Queensland before they're put into their registry, and it's one of the things that comes up as being a default, an error.
As it would.
Yeah.
Thanks. So there are optional provisions in the AHD, and the form actually says in the notes you are encouraged but are not required to seek medical advice. You are encouraged but are not required to seek legal advice. If you obtain advice, you may but need not identify the person who advised you, and you don't have to fill it in at all. If you don't fill it in at all, then you have to, if you do fill in any of the sections, you have to initial them. If you leave it blank, you don't have to initial it. But those are all in the instructions, but they are a little bit confusing. And then it says that nothing you do or don't do in this section will invalidate the AHD, but actually, it won't actually invalidate the AHD, but it may affect the treatment decisions. And I think Simon covered that in great detail, so I won't go into that again, because there are things that you can do that will make it much easier for doctors to interpret what you have said. And if you have put in, for instance, the name of your doctor, you've discussed it and so on, that is going to make it much easier to interpret that AHD, value statements, all of that. So now we come to the crux of the issue. An AHD contains treatment decisions in respect of any future medical treatment, and that is medical, surgical, even dental. I can't really see how dental would come up, but I dare say there are ways, and of course palliative care. So in the AHD, it's worded in those three sections as either a consent to treatment or that you refuse consent to treatment. And so, as Simon said, treatment decisions to which you consent may be provided to you. You can't dictate what the treatment should be, but it is at least a guide for your doctors to know what your preferences are. Treatment to which you refuse consent cannot be provided to you, but there are limitations. And we did touch on those exceptions, but I would like to just go through them in a slightly different way, which may be helpful when it comes to completing the form. So neither your enduring guardian nor any other person can override your instructions in the Advanced Health Directive. So the limitations. Capacity may be a limitation. I think that the Guardianship Act says that if there are any doubts about capacity, then that would be a reason not to have to follow your directions. And so what can you do to ensure that your wishes are respected? First of all, there is that presumption that you have capacity unless there's some evidence to the contrary. And also there are the witnesses who witness either you or the person that you directed sign the document, and they are the witnesses with their names and addresses. They can be contacted for evidence about capacity. But I suppose the most relevant issue might be if you were in, for instance, the early stages of dementia. And you may well have the capacity at that stage to know what the nature and effect of these decisions are that you're making, but your doctors may not be happy to accept that, in which case a mental assessment, and presumably, Simon, you can address this, a doctor's certificate to say that their assessment was that when you signed this AHD, you did have mental capacity.
I think that's another reason why having a doctor in the other section helps.
Yeah.
And the challenge there with the witnesses is they don't have a responsibility under the Act to have made an assessment of your capacity, but they are observers.
Observers, yeah. There's also the provision that if there was any coercion or inducement, if there was some evidence or possibility that had occurred, that would also be a reason to allow your doctors not to follow your wishes. And that is another really good reason why you should not only discuss this with your doctor, but you should also discuss it with your family. And so this doesn't come as a surprise out of the blue for them. So they know what you've asked for, and if possible, are on side with it. Doesn't matter if they disagree with you. Doesn't matter if your doctors disagree with you. Their job is just to say, okay, this is the law. I respect it. I respect your decision to make this choice for yourself. Ambiguity, again, another really, really good reason to sit with your doctor and say, this is what I was proposing to say in my AHD. Does that make sense to you? Have I expressed it clearly? Should I change it in some way? And so you work through it together, just as Anne Beveridge did with her palliative care specialist. And so you can develop a document that is going to make sense to your doctors, because as you say, you're not going to have the same doctor when the time comes, but at least there has been a medical mind that has been turned to what you have said. Could the AHD be out of date and unforeseen changes that may have caused you to change your mind? I think that we covered that in some detail, so I won't go there again. Emergency, I would just like to tell a little story of my own. When my husband and I got a farm in Manjimup, and we were riding in the forest one day, and our horses were attacked by dogs. And he had scrambled off because he saw the dogs coming. I had stayed aboard, but I didn't stay there for very long because obviously my horse was panicked. And thank goodness the horses are okay, if anybody was going to ask me that. But I broke my leg quite severely about two years ago, this was. And as I lay there on the forest floor, I thought, well, if I hit my head on a rock or something, I would now be unconscious. But that, of course, would constitute an emergency when those lovely people from St. John's Ambulance turn up. They can't be expected to go scrambling around thinking, has this unconscious person got an AHD? In those circumstances, they are just really keen to get you to the nearest hospital, and once you're in the hospital, then the paperwork can start. But instead, because I was conscious, they just gave me a wonderful green whistle, and I made me fall in love with all of them instantly. But that is an example of circumstances in which an emergency would mean that people didn't have to go and suss out your AHD. Would you agree?
Yeah, but I think in that scenario, it would be one of those ones where the reasonable person would say that you're now lying on the ground with a broken leg, and we're not going to leave you there regardless.
Well, exactly.
And there is a compassionate issue here about you may not want ongoing treatment, but at least we're going to put you in a splint, get you to somewhere where you can have pain relief, and that would be considered compassionate care, irregardless of what we think about ongoing care issues.
Right.
And that's partly what that reasonableness thing is all about. So it's quite a nice hypothetical to defend. There's no way
Yes.
whether you wanted to go to hospital or not, I'm not going to leave you on the forest floor with the wild dogs with a broken leg.
Yeah. I was happy about that. And just for your interest, here's a picture of me on my horse about 6 years ago, and she and I are still friends.
I'm very pleased to see you've got a helmet.
Okay, now we get to the pointy end of all this, circumstances and the treatment decisions. And as has been stressed a number of times, it's really important that you describe clearly what the circumstances are in which a particular treatment will apply. So this is mine, and I'm going to read it. But perhaps you shouldn't look at the screen for a moment. I'll just read it to you, and maybe you can let it sink in and see if it makes sense to you, and then Simon will critique it for me. So, if at any time I should have an incurable or irreversible condition caused by injury, disease, or illness, certified to be a terminal condition by a physician, and the application of life-sustaining treatment and or procedures would serve only to artificially postpone the moment of my death,
and or my attending physician determines that my death is imminent or will occur within a relatively short time in the absence of such life-sustaining treatment and or procedures. Perhaps relatively short time, I should put in an actual time frame there. Or, and then these are more circumstances, thanks Marky. Or if at any time I am in a coma for any reason and my health professionals are of the view that I will not recover sufficiently to live independently. Or if I have a stroke or I'm suffering from dementia so that I do not recognise my family and am unable to live independently. Or I'm suffering from an incurable but not necessarily terminal disease and have lost the capacity to make decisions. Then in any of the above circumstances, I consent to pain relief and palliative care designed to make me comfortable. I refuse consent to all life-sustaining treatment and or procedures likely to prolong my life. Now that's the overarching. Then I get into the detail a little bit. So without limiting the above directions, I do not consent to being kept alive with assisted feeding, hydration, breathing, or blood transfusion. And you can see I've highlighted breathing because I'm thinking of taking that out because I have a terrible horror of suffocation. But anyway, you just put in what you want to put in. I do not consent to having any invasive life support intervention measures, including resuscitation or CPR. I do not consent to being given antibiotics or other medicines that may prolong my life. And this one is really important to me and maybe to you. I do not consent to being in a facility that allows religious or other opinions from administrators of health or health professionals to override any part of the directives given in this document. And then finally, assisted dying that is not voluntary assisted dying, because of course you have no capacity, and in voluntary assisted dying you need to have capacity at every stage of the process. If I meet the criteria specified in the Western Australian law to qualify me for assisted dying, other than having the necessary mental capacity, it is my clear and unambiguous request for terminal palliative sedation to assist me to die peacefully. And at the urging of Richard Lugg, I added those words in brackets, as soon as my attending doctor forms the view that terminal sedation is clinically justified. And I think that's it from me. But one more. These are further resources. We have got some frequently asked questions, and there are handouts at the back of the room. We will also add to those some of the questions that have been asked today and some of the answers. Sometimes it will just be too detailed to put into a form, but those will go up on the website. Also, Tristan, our lovely cameraman, he's been away in Exmouth and I haven't been able to get hold of him. He's been out of communication. But now he's back in Perth. He can run, but he can't hide. So the video from our last session will go up maybe in the next week or so. And this video will also be available in a little while. But those are the formal websites. I think I've forgotten who it was now who asked me to put this up, but is that correct, that information there, Simon? So if you want to look at my values website, myvalues.org.au, and there are a number of places where you can find authorised witnesses, and there are ordinary people like chemists and doctors and bankers and policemen and so on, but your doctor is really your first port of call, in my opinion. So I raced through that a little bit because time was short, and it's important that we have a few questions. But yes, thank you very much. Sorry, one last thing. This sample AHD is at the back of the room if you're interested, just to use it as an example. But Simon, I would be very interested in your view about how effective that would be.
The quality of that advanced health directive is the kind of quality I think you need to try and put into it. So the directions are clear and the circumstances are clear. I think the thoughts that have gone into that, and that whole thing about the form's not very flexible, but that staged process that was used there is completely legitimate. Essentially getting multiple issues into one section. I think I would encourage you to look at those words and think about them. From my point of view, as a senior clinician, if I get an advanced health directive like that, and I'm pretty clear what is required, and some people might say that I don't find a lot of wriggle room. I'm not trying to wriggle, although other people are trying to wriggle. But that is useful. The clinical circumstances are well described. The issues of what you would or wouldn't want are very clear. I think it's very valuable to do things like putting in that you consent to palliative care, because if you don't do something special around the palliative care piece and say that I refuse treatment, then people then become concerned that they cannot provide proper palliative care services, which I think is important. Doctors get all funny about legal requirements. If it doesn't give you consent to do that, then although it may be completely appropriate from a duty of care point of view, you end up with ambiguity on the doctor's side, not ambiguity on your side. So that clarity, clinical circumstances, what the issues are, what I consent to, what I don't consent to, and then framing it up in ways which make it very clear what your values are. I mean, the commentary at the end is the most interesting one, first time I've encountered it. I've yet to consider what I think about all that. But that is very helpful. That gives me a very clear view of the person's position and what they are seeking to achieve. So well done. I'll change mine to look much more like that.